Welcome back to Data Nerds. This is, I guess, a different style of episode for Data Nerds. We're not coming in with a case specifically. We're actually looking at a case that we talked about in our episode last week, just on an article. But there is so much stuff in this article that we thought. Well, one, we're already going to split it up into two parts, but then we're actually going to add this third part with the data nerds to go over like how they use their counter movement jump testing clinically, because they have a lot of really good information on that. Yeah, Pat, I don't know if you wanted to say anything.
Just reflecting back that they are doing counter movement jump and the isometric mid thigh pull as their two kind of proxies for strength and progress through the rehab process. So, like what Mike was saying, they have pre-injury data on this athlete, so gives a little bit of an insight into their not only like actual outputs for a counter movement jump and time in which they can complete it, but also qualitatively, how does the athlete actually perform said jump, like the actual execution. So, yeah, that's all I got.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of be jumping around through like the figures a little bit on this. They have some really detailed figures. Like, we were just off air, we're looking at some of them, and like there was color coding that we didn't even realize existed before until we started like looking at it more deeply. So like, just as an example, you guys can see figure 2 here, going through their entire return to performance continuum. Like, there is a lot of stuff in this. We're going to cover a decent amount of this in our other two episodes. We're really focusing on this like bottom part, on the counter movement jump stuff and like when it's performed. Yeah, I guess I'll come back to this more for like the timing of the testing. But I guess to start to, yeah, as Pat said, they're doing counter movement jump testing. They're using a dual force platform with double leg counter movement jumps, so not any single leg. They talk about how this is important because there are many compensatory strategies that are persistent and are of concern post ACLR. And especially they have this abbreviation or acronym CMJ alt for these alternative variables that have been found to be pretty important. So those that quantify phase durations, or rates, or time limited force, power characteristics, or CMJ mechanics during eccentric and concentric phases. So those are some of the stuff that we'll be going over in this table 1, this large 2-page table that has a ton of information. Yeah. So why don't we look more at this? You guys can see this, right, Pat?
Yep. Yeah, that's all good.
Cool. I don't know. Would you want to go over a little bit the like what we're actually looking at here? I can zoom in a little bit.
Yeah.
Just
So
this one.
if you're looking at A there, that is the force, velocity, power, displacement time curves. And then if we're looking at B, that's the involved and uninvolved force time curves and the selected asymmetries. What they did here as well on both of them, you have the displacement and the power right there represented as a little stick figure. That gives you a nice little representation of where is the athlete actually through the counter movement. I think this is really good to visualize because I think one of the initial learning curves when looking at counter movement jump data is recognizing where these phases are and how they should be presenting. One of them is the eccentric DXL to the force at zero velocity. Because if you were to look at it initially, I feel like most people intuitively just think that um, if you're going down, then you must be unweighting the whole way. And then when the force is only applied on the way up, well, that is not true. That is true how there is a slight yielding period or unweighting phase, but then you actually start to produce force to control that deacceleration to then get to the bottom of your counter movement jump, which is your counter movement depth. This is one of the markers that you should be looking for as a qualitative how is someone performing it, because um, sometimes you can look at two different counter movement jumps and get the same outputs, but the actual qualitative way they've done it, as in like the depth, might change. And just understanding how that kind of relates to each other. I would say if you're looking for something more in depth on that, no pun intended, uh, you should check out articles by like Chris Bishop. We'll probably go through it a little bit because they discuss it in their table 1 that we'll go through. But I would say if you're interested in the actual metrics and how they relate to each other, looking up Selecting Metrics That Matter by Chris Bishop et al. But so as we see here, that eccentric DXL is what they're really going to be looking at, as that gives you an idea into how strong are the quads and those anterior knee structures at producing force to control the limb and trunk towards the ground, which is going to be important for tasks such as deacceleration and change of direction for soccer players.
Yeah, just because I haven't used force plates. Have you? I can't remember. Have you used force plates?
Yep. Yeah.
Does it, so on force plate data, does it show a graph like with all three of these on it? Like, does it give the force, power, and velocity graphs, or is it just the force time curve?
Uh, with what I use it for, I just get the force time curve. Um, you can go through afterwards and post, like post session. That's what I mean by
Hmm.
post. And do get like a more in-depth breakdown on these different values graphically. I can't say I've looked at it in a while, but I do know it's available to you. So,
Yeah, I just figured that could be nice for people, like if they're not used to reading just a force time curve, to be able to, like, if it gives you power, then it's very easy to see, like, oh, this is the point where they're at zero velocity. This is their full depth, like that sort of thing. Um, yeah.
totally.
Um, so I guess before I move off of this, anything else
Anything
you think people
else?
should know about this? Yeah.
Um, I don't think so, since I think everything else will kind of come up in table 1.
Yeah.
I guess we could go through it just briefly on the phases there that are on the bottom. It's just unweighting,
Mhm.
yielding, eccentric, DXL, concentric. So concentric being the actual propulsion up from the force at zero velocity up until flight, which is when you are obviously off of the plates, and then landing. So that's like your phases there. And, you know, different force outputs and other qualitative and quantitative values that come out of that. So,
Yeah. And again, we'll go over some of the things that they're really looking at, but like thinking about like peak landing force, that eccentric decel, looking at the different power peaks too. Like that's all. There's a lot of different information you can take away from this. So that's a reason that we wanted to do this, was to be like, okay, what did they look at to at least kind of streamline our process or your process if you're new to force plates.
mhm.
So I guess to quickly go back to, oh, now everything's turned around. To quickly go back to figure 2, just so now we know like what the counter movement jump is. So like when did they do it? They have 5 different ones, I believe.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
do.
And so we have this graph shows early rehab, return to participation, return to sport, and then I think over here too, return to performance. They're really looking at, so they first do a counter movement jump that's at a submax one. That's done probably right around 4 months when they go from like this very early rehab to starting their gym based physical prep. Um, so this is not something they're doing, like they're doing it often and throughout the process, but not very early on in the process. Because obviously we're just thinking about making sure that we're protecting, like allowing for healing, stuff like that. This is a, I guess in general, this is a big focus on like post 4 months, all this stuff. So submax at 4 months, then this is probably 5-ish months, maybe 5.5 months doing the first maximal one, then around 6 months doing the next, and then there's 2 others fairly close together, probably around like 7 months, 7, 8 months, and then 9 months. Also roughly is going to be that 5th one. So I think there's probably no perfect solution to this, but essentially once they get to 6 months, they're probably doing one every month through 9 months. So that could be something that if you're working with people post ACLR, that's something that you could implement. I don't know if you had any other thoughts on that, or if we can just go over to table 1.
Nah, yeah, let's just go into table 1, see
Yeah.
on what we're kind of looking at here. I don't think I don't know how much weight
Yeah.
I'm putting into the submax here, but
Yeah.
going into kind of that submax, like the first max jump, for anyone who is looking at this on video or actually has the article, I would say the italicized portions, usually starting with trends, is going to give you the interpretation from the authors here, which is kind of where we will be spending most of our conversation. But kind of what did they see from submax to the max, the first max test was an increase in the eccentric peak velocity and the depth of the counter movement, and an increased total eccentric DXL RFD, and larger increase in involved limb than the involved limb output. Uh, Peak landing force increased and decrease in peak landing force asymmetry from 46 to 2% higher on the involved. So, kind of big takeaway from this one. This indicates an increased capacity and willingness to eccentrically load in deeper flexion without involved limb decel load avoidance. Similar absence of avoidance strategy on landing despite increase in total peak landing force. So essentially they're saying, hey, this person doesn't mind loading this knee and they're not having significant stress shielding during the counter movement. Positive,
Yeah.
progress as needed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like your point that you like made early on too about like not looking too much at the submax one, and then also not looking too much at submax to max, because there's probably some of these things are going to change just because you're changing the intent with it.
Mhm.
So I think it's more important to look at the trends from max to like max 1 through max 5. But still, it's nice to do the submax and be like, hey, look, you can do this, uh,
Mhm.
especially at that 4-month mark.
Yeah.
Um, but then if we do start looking at like, okay, what do we see from max 1 to max 2? There's again an increase in eccentric peak velocity, an increase in counter movement depth, without an increase in eccentric deceleration asymmetry. So they're saying this suggests increased confidence and capacity in loading. I actually really like the wording of both confidence and capacity, because some of this stuff too could just purely be like, okay, now they're getting accommodated to the test again, like they're getting used to it. And I want to say in their new body, which I know is like kind of a weird thing to say, but like there is changes in proprioception after ACLR, so they have to get used to these higher level, higher force motions. So that is a lot about just gaining confidence. And I like that they're also pointing out like the deeper knee flexion too. And then there's increase in flight time flight time contraction time ratio, eccentric peak power, total eccentric deceleration. Again, their findings, this is indicative of positive adaptations in both uninvolved and involved limbs to increased load and velocity, plyometric landing activity, concurrent with their anti-gravity treadmill running. So they're saying like, hey, this is kind of going in line with the other stuff that we're doing anyway. To me, I read that as more of a just like almost more of a neuromuscular component of like, hey, they're just getting used to plyometric things again. I don't know if you see that differently at all.
No, I agree.
But yeah, then there's also increase in jump height. So you could just use that very roughly as like, okay, they're putting more force into the ground. There's also a decrease in total peak landing force to body weight. Man, that's a wild
Metric.
wild ratio there.
Yeah.
um, and then there's also decrease in that compared to jump height. I believe
Yeah.
that's how they're saying that.
Yeah, I would say overall what they're seeing is person is doing this faster, person is going deeper. So, you know, with RFD trends similar, then okay, we're looking at just like greater compliance and comfortability with going into that movement.
Yeah, and I think this last piece here too is pretty important that they have in their like, whoop, I just highlighted it in their takeaways is like the total peak landing force indices are now below pre-injury values, which shows some limb avoidance too. So just having lower values from a previous uh, test doesn't necessarily make it better too. I think that's something to think about as well. So you could think that, you know, probably around this time too, they're starting to load it more, but also try to like, or they're trying to do harder things, but decrease the load that limb is getting.
Yeah. And then I would say moving on, I think the next one is kind of the juicy bit, right? I think this is where they kind of saw a little bit of I don't want to say it's a ripple because I would say this is a normal response as which is what they kind of discussed also. But so if you look at the table, there is no number 3. You go from 2 to 4. And they say why that is because max 3 and 4 were performed following a week of new loading demands. And then they said right there that new load is expected to have some residual fatigue. So they considered max 2 to 3 and 3 to 4 separately to the overall trends between 1, 2, and 5. So although, you know, this is a 2 through 4, it's only labeled as that because 3 is kind of still stuck in there and they're only going to talk about it. They aren't separating it out like how they do for all the other ones. I hope that made sense. But so kind of what did they see from 2 to 3? a big decrease in the force at zero velocity, eccentric DXL RFD, concentric impulse, increase asymmetries due to a larger decrease in uninvolved than involved limb performance. So, like for example, the force at zero velocity involved was 555 newtons to 533, uninvolved was 527 to 453, and so forth with other values. So what does this mean if you see the total force at zero velocity and eccentric DXL trending that way? Suggesting just some neuromuscular fatigue. So they think this is just due to the person returning to more on pitch activity. So just full weight bearing running, there's a lot of kind of neuromuscular demands that are going on there. And so they believe this is causing this fatigue and decrease in values. And it's not something to worry about and think that this person is going backwards. It's just a recognition. I know in terms of like isometric and isokinetic data, when people return to running as well, there should be some kind of asterisks to where you might see like a slight dip, or you just might not see like a large progression for like the same idea.
Yeah, yeah, I even see that, like, not necessarily with people returning to running, but, like, just sometimes people come into clinic, we do testing that day, like isometric strength testing, and they had just run before, and so, like, I have to put that caveat on all the numbers because often the numbers aren't necessarily where I would like them to be, but that's probably from some of this fatigue. Um,
Yeah, exactly. So
um,
I would say going further, max 4, so 3 to 4. Um, Still, they were just increasing their running loading by increasing their on pitch sessions. Same recovery of force at zero velocity and concentric impulse 100, but remained below max 2 output. So, kind of just saying they trended back upwards, but still below what they were at max 2. So then we get into max 5, which if we look up back on the chart, that is around, what would we say there? Like 7, 8
Yeah,
months,
I'm looking
maybe.
at it to the side
Sideways.
here. So
Yeah.
yeah, so yeah, 7, 8 months makes sense to me.
Yeah. Essentially, most of those forces were relatively stable and recovered after the declines that we saw on the max 2 and max 3. Decreased total eccentric DXL RFD with a larger decrease on the uninvolved than the involved limb. So much so that the involved limb eccentric DCell RFD was now greater than 10% of the uninvolved. Increase on uninvolved limb peak landing force, and decrease in uninvolved limb leading to a asymmetry shift from 60% higher on uninvolved to 1% higher on involved. So what does this kind of mean? The absolute and trends and percent asymmetry indicate greater contribution of the involved limb during DXL and landing load acceptance tasks. Total concentric impulse shows small increase, with both limbs increasing and a small decline in concentric impulse asymmetry to 9%. So
Yeah. I'd
trending.
say overall, yeah, like the big trends from all these two are like it's improving over time, right? Like
Yep.
that's just what you expect. Again, similarly, like looking really at like the force too. Force metrics are getting better um, across all of these.
Yep. Yeah. And I would say kind of taking a look, or maybe not a look, but thinking about what are they looking at, and putting kind of a recognition in what they're looking at. And if we've noticed thus far, I feel like Mike and I have said eccentric peak
Yep.
power, peak force, eccentric decel. Um, a lot of this is on that eccentric aspect, and I think this goes to say that you need to have a good DXL and eccentric to then have a good XL or concentric. You can't have a shitty setup to then have a good output. You can only get better from those earlier stages. So if anyone is looking at kind of counter movement jump information, I would say always just start on the furthest left of the force time curve, go through kind of like a mental checklist of what things are looking like and what values are looking like. And I assure you that like if you find something in one of those early like eccentric decel phase, you'll probably see something happen along the way as well, just because that's going to highlight a lot and kind of set the person up for what's to come.
Yeah, and they talk about that. So then this last section too, I like the return to sport criteria. So they like talk about, they kind of give like a story in the beginning, but I kind of like this, fourth paragraph down, where they say we prioritize recovery of eccentric deceleration and landing load acceptance, because based on the evidence of persistence of deficit/avoidance strategies in these phases and associated poor knee function. They were also interested in the progression of overall performance and reducing concentric impulse asymmetry, which at return to sport was 9%, slightly above the mean +1 standard deviation. They were comparing her to healthy, uninjured male professional players, probably because the research doesn't show too much about females, unfortunately. That's definitely a lapse in the research. So, is this totally accurate to her population? No, but at least it's professional soccer players, uninjured professional soccer players. Yeah, and they also talk about how they like having the relative to pre-injury values, but it is kind of hard to use those as a benchmark too, because I think in the pre-injured values they had a 17% asymmetry in some of the metrics that they wanted, and so they didn't necessarily consider that sensible to get back to. I'm guessing they wanted slightly less than 17. Usually it's less than 10%. Yeah. Anything else in table 1? I know there's even more below.
Yeah, but I would say we mostly touched on a lot of it for sure.
Yeah.
The only thing I would say is that the only thing that was not included, which like one of my coworkers and I were talking about this past weekend, is a loaded counter movement jump. Now, reason you might do this is because a lot of these eccentric braking forces, so like the eccentric peak force and DXL, like RFD and such, can actually normalize to body weight. So essentially, someone can get really good at doing it with their body weight, but of course, as stated throughout the literature, the counter movement jump is considered like a slow plyometric, so greater than 250 milliseconds. And if we're looking at in sport, there just might be actions that require more force, especially if we're talking about like single limb. And so a way to kind of extrapolate if someone truly has recovered a lot of good eccentric DXL ability is utilizing a like trap bar and having 30% body mass for the first trial and then 60% body mass for the second trial. And that actually can continue to indicate if someone has recovered those eccentric properties and abilities. And they've shown that between body weight and going to the loaded, people can still kind of hide that ability with body weight, but then it's inflated when you add load to it.
That's actually a really good point. I hadn't thought of before. So yeah, that's I get why they
Dude is
didn't
lost
do
for
that,
words.
but I know I'm just like, man, now I just want to like see what that looks like again. it makes sense that they didn't do that because they wanted to be able to compare test to
Right.
test. Um,
Exactly.
and they weren't doing that pre-injury, but like that does make a good intervention too, and just like you can track intervention as well. Just putting that out there. Um, but I also want to spend some time talking about figure 5 too. Again, they have a ton of figures in this. We went over some of them. We're not going to be going over the rest of these. Just it's at least not in this one. There's already a lot of time. But there's a lot of lines on figure 5. It can be kind of jumbled. So I I especially this top one, like they look very similar between things. Um, so what I really want to focus on is especially this middle set of lines. This is the force curve of the counter movement jumps, especially what is it? It's the takeoff phase. So obviously they don't show like the rest of the jump here. Um, and I just want to highlight. So we have the pre-injury, which is this green line here that I'm kind of tracing if you're watching. And then there's also this light blue line of the counter movement jump 1 year return to sport. So this isn't even in their return to performance phase, which was 13 to 14 like plus months, but they've returned to sport. It's a year. This is often when people are cleared for like unrestricted return to sport. I mean, sometimes it's even 9 months afterwards, which we could look at like the purple line, but now distinguishing purple from this dark blue, like good luck. So looking at the green and the light blue, green again looks here as uninjured, and then this uh, still 1 year post, they have this slightly longer unweighting phase. The peak force still doesn't get as high, and then you can see they have this like much longer time where they're generating that like uh, concentric force as well until they then come come back down. So I guess my point in saying this is still, it still looks very different after 1 year compared to pre-injury. So that tells me that there's like still a long way to go as well. So don't just use timelines to be like, oh, this should be good. Like that's where having this data is super important.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, now you're at a loss for words.
Speechless. Got each other speechless.
um, yeah, so that was the main thing I wanted people to take away from this. There's lots of other things that you could look at in figure 5. If you guys have the article, go
Uh,
for it. But
yeah, we
is
didn't
there
even
anything else you wanted to mention?
I was to say we didn't even touch on figure 4. It was a lot of just kind of what we talked about verbally, but it gives a nice graphical representation of the metrics that were written out in table 1. But so I don't think it's necessary for us to kind of go through. But again, just another table and figure to stare at and contemplate if you're doing anything correct in life.
Yeah, the meaning of life. Yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't even look too much at these either just because of how small they are. Like, and then again, there's a lot of
The
lines.
shapes. Yeah, the little
Yeah, like
shapes to yeah.
so it's tough. It's tough to really understand what's going on with these without again just spending lots of time contemplating the meaning of life. But I think that's a good spot to wrap this up. Hopefully, this was a little helpful. To let me get rid of that. Let's whoop. Um, to have a little better understanding of like how at least they used counter movement jump, what metrics they looked at, and yeah, I guess to wrap to summarize that, like eccentric eccentric deceleration, baby.
Yeah, and you
That's
know what? You know what goes with that? Quads. Quads.
quad. Yeah,
Quads.
they didn't even. I know we mentioned this before, but they weren't even really looking too much at like isometric, isokinetic quad stuff as well, and so they just kind of like took this and isometric mid thigh pull as surrogates for quad strength as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, again, lots more to talk about with this episode. So stay tuned for next week too. But as always, if you have listened this far, I know this is a little longer one. We appreciate it. Please, if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a nice review. It means a lot. And if you're listening or you're watching on YouTube, please leave a like, subscribe if you want. We always put the data nerds on YouTube. So thanks.